Today we're going to be reviewing and benchmarking what I think is hands down the best budget gaming laptop here in 2020, and we're even going to be upgrading it. Let's get into it. Hey, welcome to Zach's Tech Turf. Today we're going to be taking a look at the new $300 Walmart branded Motile 14 gaming laptop, which I think is the best gaming laptop for a budget on paper, and we're going to see if it's as good as I think it is. And if you're new here and you want to see other PC hardware videos just like this one, then hit that subscribe button down below and also that notification bell. That way you never miss an episode. But yeah, let's check this thing out. So right off the bat, before diving into the specs, I want to share my first initial surprise that I had with the Motile 14. As soon as I pulled this thing out of the box and took a peek around the device, I honestly just couldn't fathom how clean and well built this thing was for a super budget price tag of just $300. Starting with the physical tour, the body is certainly made out of all plastic, which is to be expected. However, it definitely doesn't feel like that cheap plastic, and it actually has a decent weight to it. The hinge quality is literally as sturdy as they make them, which is something that I was worried about with a budget laptop, and even the I/O on the sides are better than some like $3,000 laptops. Yeah, I'm talking about the MacBook Pro that I reviewed up here. On the right hand side, we have a power port, HDMI output, one USB Type A port, and a USB Type C port that unfortunately can't be used to charge the device. Going back to the power though, here's what the power cable and brick is looking like, and this is rocking the design that I personally like, which includes the brick up at the wall with no massive block in the middle, which is a nice change of pace. Moving on to the left side for I/O, we have a Kensington lock, Ethernet port, which is awesome for a laptop this thin, two more USB Type A ports, and an audio combo jack. Underneath the laptop, you can see there's a respectable size vent to keep the laptop nice and cool, and there's two downward facing speakers which get plenty loud enough, but yeah, the quality isn't anything to write home about. There's also some really nice long rubber feet on the bottom to keep the laptop raised for better airflow, and it also prevents the laptop from sliding around on the desk. Moving back to the front, this display is a 14-inch 1080p 60Hz panel, which for a $300 laptop is pretty nice, but it definitely doesn't get that bright, and colors aren't super accurate for color work. The keyboard, in my opinion, is good enough to be placed on a $700 or more laptop, as the keys have a nice travel distance, and I think they look super clean. They're also backlit, which I know a lot of you typers that need to look down in the middle of the night will definitely appreciate. The trackpad could use some work as it's not super responsive or smooth to use, but it does a good enough job in my opinion. Honestly, the physical tour passed every expectation that I have for a laptop at this low of a price. It's crazy. You just don't feel like you're holding a $300 laptop here. But now let's move on to the specs, because I have a feeling we're going to get the exact same feeling with this. Under the hood, this version of the Motile 14 is rocking a Ryzen 5 3500U, which is a 4-core and 8-threaded APU that can boost up to 3.7 GHz and has an integrated Vega 8 graphics chip. Yep, that's an 8-threaded Ryzen APU in a $300 laptop, which I'm still just not wrapping my head around yet. So much value here. One thing to note is that this BIOS is insanely locked down here, so don't expect to do any tweaking on this one. Outside the APU, there's also 8GB of DDR4 RAM with only a single slot, which means we won't get the benefit of dual channel memory. This is definitely the biggest flaw of the laptop in my opinion. And there's also a 256GB SSD that reads around 550 megabytes per second and writes at 462 megabytes per second according to my testing, as you can see here. Once again, just like the physical tour, I just can't wrap my head around how much value you're getting here for $300. However, despite the really good internals out of the box, I did want to try upgrading this thing with a bigger and bigger SSD as well as 16GB of RAM. For RAM, I personally went with this Patriot 16GB stick clocked at 2400 MHz, and once again, it really would have been nice to have dual channel support here, so that's really tough to see, especially with all this blank space here not doing anything. For the SSD, big thanks to Corsair for hooking me up with a 480GB MP510, which has honestly been my go-to M.2 SSD in my last few builds. The Motile 14 actually comes with a blank M.2 slot, so you can still rock the original one as your boot drive as well. Now, neither of these upgrades are actually going to affect the performance of gaming. With the settings that we're going to have to use with a budget APU like this, we're not going to see any games go above 8GB of RAM. However, these upgrades will allow us to have a massive gaming library compared to what I originally could have done, plus I'll be able to do some more multitasking with the 16GB of RAM. Speaking of that game library though, without our Corsair MP510, I would have had to benchmark only a couple of games at a time, uninstall them, and then install other games, but now I could easily store a decent library on this drive. Starting with Fortnite, with the Motile 14, I had to put the settings at 720p 1080p to get a more reliable FPS average, and with low settings and a locked FPS cap at 60 to keep it more consistent, I got an average of 59 frames per second. Next up was Rainbow Six Siege, and with the built-in benchmark at 720p and low settings, I got an average of 65 frames per second. Now before moving on, yes, I am saying 720p. This budget APU can't crank out 1080p and 60 FPS for most games as expected. However, 720p on a really small display like this one doesn't look nearly as terrible as 720p on like a 27-inch monitor. Moving on, next up we have Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and for this one I was at 720p and low again and got everyone's favorite 69 FPS. For our last easy to run game, I fired up WoW Classic. This was the only one that I could actually keep it at 1080p, and with the level 3 classic settings I got 83 frames per second. Getting into our AAA games, I fired up Gears 5, and with the built-in benchmark in 720p and low, I got a low but definitely smooth and playable 35 FPS average. And finally, the last game that I tested was Call of Duty Modern Warfare, and in 720p and low settings, I actually had to lock the FPS at 30 to make it a bit more playable, and with that I averaged 27 frames per second. So yeah, the Motile 14 isn't what I would buy if you're interested in playing AAA titles. No laptop for $300 or really even $500 would get that job done. However, if you're in the market for a super budget laptop that can actually hold its own in some esport titles, this is the one, chief. Well, that wraps up my review, benchmarks, and upgrades with the Motile 14 budget gaming laptop. As always, drop a comment down below about what you thought of this laptop or what other laptop you want to see me review next. After that, feel free to head on over to one of these two videos if you haven't seen them yet, and definitely hit that subscribe button because coming up next, yet another gaming PC build guide. You don't want to miss that video.